You're listening to Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk. Each week, your host, Polly Requa, interviews veterinarians and individuals in the pet industry from across the nation answering pet questions. Bark and Wag podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes can be found at barkandwag.com under the podcast tab. That's BARKNWAG.com. Please remember to subscribe to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk.
Welcome to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk. I'm your host, Polly Requa. Today we're talking to Dr. Peggy Larson, founder of National Spay and Neuter Coalition and partner in local spay-neuter clinic from Vermont. Peggy has also spoken at many seminars and conferences throughout the United States addressing pet overpopulation and inhumane treatment of rodeo animals. I wanted to bring Peggy on the podcast because we recently went to a rodeo in Vail, Colorado. Welcome, Peggy. Thank you for being our guest today.
Good morning. How are things in Colorado?
They're pretty cold. It snowed.
I'll trade you. We've had record heat here.
Oh, wow. Well, we'll
send
you
some of it
snow.
east.
I wanted to have you on the podcast because this summer I took my two children to a rodeo in Vail, and we had never been to a rodeo, and we found it so disturbing and inhumane that at the halftime we actually left. My 12-year-old daughter asked if the cows were still alive. I mean, it was horrendous. And so I just wanted to have you on because I know that you have shut down some rodeos in other countries, and wanted to see if you could talk about the rodeo industry and how our listeners and myself can help make rodeos illegal.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that you took your children, because one of the concerns that many of us who are fighting the rodeo is that rodeo is animal abuse. There's no question in anybody's minds that these animals are abused. You can't make an animal behave the way they do without doing something to them that's abusive. Children should not be exposed to this. When you see a man drive spurs into the shoulders of a poor horse, what message does that send to your children? I'm very glad that you and your children left the rodeo, because that was a smart thing to do. Kids should not be taught that treating animals like this is okay. Basically, rodeo is basically founded on animal abuse. You can't get an animal to buck without doing something to make it buck. And the way you do that is you put a flank strap on it, because a flank strap is irritating to an animal. It's not tight. If you put it on too tight, the animal will lie down. But it's irritating. The animal kicks to get the thing off of its body. And then you combine that with driving spurs into the shoulders of the horse, or in the case of a bull, into its sides. I laid on the floor one day and I kicked my heels into a bathroom scale, and I was able to kick 50 pounds. Now, I'm a 5'4", 135-pound woman. You can imagine how many pounds a man would be able to kick spurs into the shoulders of a horse or into the belly of a bull. The spurs are blunted, but blunt trauma is as bad sometimes as sharp trauma. So these horses are spurred on every jump, which is about 8 seconds. They have to be spurred on each jump, otherwise the rider is disqualified. And so many times these rodeo people say, oh, these horses are bred to buck. They're born to buck. So we say, get rid of the spurs, get rid of the flank strap, and we will have no objection to rodeo. If you want to kick them in the shoulders with your boot heels, that's fine. But every time they've backed down. They've had no comments on that. They've never been able to justify their behavior towards these animals. So basically the cruelest thing in the bucking events are driving those spurs into the animal's body. This mimics a predator. If a horse is a prey animal, so is a cow. And so when these spurs are driven into the shoulders, the animal thinks, oh my God, I'm being attacked by a mountain lion, and tries desperately, is very fearful. The whole thing is based on fear and fright and trying to get this predator off its back. However, the worst event in rodeo is calf roping. They take these little baby calves that are still on their mothers. They're not weaned yet. They probably weigh somewhere around 300 pounds. And they put them in a chute, a holding chute, and then they twist their tails, or they hit them with 5,000 volts of electric shock with a cattle prod, trying to make them burst out of that chute as fast as they can, so that the roper has more of gains more points with the behavior of the calf. The calf breaks out, goes fast, and he stops it dead and flips it over. This gives him points. So the calf bursts out of the chute, trying to get away from the pain. The rider ropes him, basically strangles him with a rope, knocks him off his feet, and then goes over and ties him up as the horse is oftentimes dragging this calf by the neck as the horse is backing up to keep the rope tight. So many calves are injured in this event. I talked to a couple of meat inspectors, including the head of FSIS, Food, Health, and Safety Inspection. And he said when he was a meat inspector at in Cheyenne, he used to get calves come in from the Cheyenne Rodeo with broken backs, broken necks, internal bleeding, as much as 3 gallons of blood under the skin of some of these animals, and just in a horribly abused condition. It was like they were mauled by a mountain lion. They were just in the process, basically, of dying. And some of them, of course, were dead when they reached the slaughter plant, and they went for pet food. So these are the worst events. And then you can talk about team roping, where one cowboy ropes the front feet, the other cowboy ropes the back feet, and then they stretch this animal out. Well, you're putting an awful lot of stress on those bones, joints, tendons, muscles. And many times those animals, when they get up, they don't walk away without limping on one or the other limbs. There's another really, really horrendous event in rodeo, and they don't have it in most rodeos because it's so incredibly harmful to the animals. It's called steer busting or steer tripping. And what this roper does is, again, the animal is put in a chute, shocked, tail twisted, anything to make him break out of that chute as fast as he can. And the animal is roped around the horns, and then the rope is flipped over his rear end in order to trip him. So these animals are running at full speed. All of a sudden, they're knocked off their feet, and they hit the ground extremely hard. Then they're dragged, and many of those animals are injured. Some states won't allow this event anymore. The cruelty in this event is just beyond belief.
And so when we were in Vail, there was a vet on staff, and I said to the girls, what vet would even be part of it?
Well, when I was talking to the American Veterinary Medical Association in Schaumburg, Illinois, I flew down there to address their animal welfare committee on the abuses in rodeo. And one of the speakers there was a veterinarian. And guess what? He was a calf roper. So veterinarians come in all sizes, shapes, and colors, and mental attitude towards animals. I know several veterinarians that are rodeo performers, and I don't know how they justify this. The AVMA has never seen the light on this issue. They still consider rodeo acceptable. But then the AVMA also considers hogs in gestation crates as acceptable farm practice. They consider hens in batteries as acceptable. The AVMA is not focused on the animal. It's more focused on the income of the people who use animals. So years ago, I left the AVMA because their animal policies were so anti-animal. Another thing I would like to say about these people that rope steers or rope calves, they have to practice. So what they do is they will buy a half a dozen animals, and then they will use these animals over and over and over again to practice until the animal either dies or is too injured to continue. And some of these have wound up in the slaughter plants too. The gentleman who was head of FSIS was one who saw animals that like that when he was a veterinary meat inspector. So you have to keep in mind too that in order to get good at these things, people have to practice. So the practice animals are basically just disposable.
And so what can we do to help shut down rodeos besides not attending?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question. One of the prime movers in this country against rodeo is Steve Hindy's group. It's called SHARK, SHARK, and it means Showing Animals Respect and Kindness. And I would suggest to anybody who wants to help get rid of rodeo, perhaps a donation to Steve's organization would be a way to help without getting involved in protests or legislation or things like that, because most people don't have much time. But I know Steve Hindy. I've been at his house. He and I have worked together on many of these rodeo issues. It's been a long, hard struggle. And for one person to think that perhaps they can do something, it's very difficult. You might want to look at your state, see how many rodeos are there, talk to your Congress people, see if there's anything that you can do to get them to, for instance, stop calf roping. If we could stop calf roping, we would stop most of the fatalities in rodeo. Most of the fatalities are in calf roping. So if we start with something like that, that would at least get rid of the most egregious event in rodeo. But meanwhile, Steve and I continue working. Steve has been extremely helpful. He's very good at what he does. He owns a manufacturing company, so he spends a lot of his own money being on the road, stopping pigeon chutes and anything that's abusive to animals. Shark is involved. I would strongly advise anybody who listens to this podcast to sign up for their newsletter so you can see what this man and his organization has done. He's done more against rodeo than anybody in the world.
And can you please tell us about how you help make rodeos illegal in other countries?
Well, yes. I've worked with Germany, France, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I'm currently working with New Zealand. One of the organizations I worked with in Australia managed to stop rodeo in the more populated parts of Australia, but not in the outback. Currently, we're dealing with rodeo in New Zealand, and I donated a camera to one of the organizations there so they could get some really good videos. And they've come up with videos to document what's happening to these animals. I'm flying there in December. I will be there for 6 weeks on a speaking tour. We feel that we probably have a pretty good chance of getting rid of rodeo in New Zealand. We'll see. The reason it's so difficult to get rid of in this country is because of the large population of people that don't seem to equate animals with having any kind of feeling. I've heard some of these people say animals don't feel pain anyway. I was in a state of shock to hear that, but I've heard it before. And many of these people at one time in their lives raised cattle, sheep, or whatever, animals for profit, for money, to make a living. And they don't have the concern for these animals. So it's very hard to get them to be against rodeo. Many of these people go to rodeos. They love rodeos. And changing their mindset is extremely difficult, especially in the red states where animal abuse is much more common. In Vermont, we don't tolerate animal abuse as readily as it's tolerated in other states.
Well, it's just horrific. So I'm so glad that you came on the podcast today to talk about it. And I'm hoping that we can, in the next few years, stop it, because it just is atrocious.
Yes, it is. It's unbelievable how bad rodeo really is. When I was in vet school, I was working for a neurosurgeon. I was a lab tech, and I worked for him to help put myself through vet school. And he would take me down to watch the brain autopsies, for people from strokes, cancer, accidents, whatever. And as he was going through these brains, he would explain to me exactly what each part was and what the function was. This was a human brain. So meanwhile, over in the vet school, I'm studying animal brains. And guess what, Polly? They're identical. The structure, the function, everything is identical in an animal brain as it is in a human brain. And that's when the lights really went on for me, because I grew up on a cattle ranch. So, animals were our income. Not that we ever mistreated them, but we knew they would go to slaughter, and that was it. We were ready to start the next year's crop, Mm-hmm. But after that epiphany, if you want to call it that, I really woke up to the fact that animals deserved better.
Yeah, definitely. Especially those poor calves. Well, we certainly appreciate you being on the podcast, and we look forward to having you back.
Well, if anybody ever wants to contact me or Steve, I don't have a website, but certainly you can make me available.
Yes, I'll put your information on the show notes, Bark and Wag 15-minute vet talk, and so people will have access to your email.
Yes, I would prefer email rather than calls because I like records.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you for listening to Bark and Wag's 15-minute vet talk. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, www.barkandwag.com, to your friends and other pet owners. Have a pressing question for a veterinarian? Ask your question at barkandwag.com under the podcast tab. This has been a KFR production. Join us next time for another edition of Bark and Wag's 15-minute vet talk.